In this video, we're going to talk about Ecology Lecture 11, which is about the aquatic ecosystems. The first question we want to answer is, what is an aquatic ecosystem? Basically, it's any ecosystem that involves water and organisms living in water. And there are certain factors that affect the aquatic ecosystem. So if you look right here, we have water's depth. So how deep the water is, temperature, because organisms all depend on certain temperature, just like organisms on land. The water flow or current also affect the living organisms in the ecosystem, and the amount of dissolved nutrients. And we're going to look more into the water depth and dissolved nutrients. The first one we want to look at is water depth. There are two words that you need to be able to differentiate. One is called photic and one is called aphotic. So if you just look at the name of these two zones, right? Photic can remind you, the pho can remind you of photosynthesis. So Photic Zone is a zone of the aquatic ecosystem, of water of some sort, that allows photosynthesis. So that's the most major difference between the Photic Zone and the aphotic zone. And the letter A tells you that it's not something, not what. In this case, is not photosynthetic, which means photosynthesis cannot occur. And why is that? Aphotic zone is much deeper than the photic zone. So the photic zone is up here and the aphotic zone is at the deeper end of the water. So photic zone allows photosynthesis can still happen because sunlight can come in to a certain depth. And then after that, the water is so deep that there is no more sunlight. So the result is you have to be able to understand this, right? Don't just memorize it. Photic zone allows photosynthesis because there is sunlight. It's about 200 meters deep, and this allows phytoplanktons to live. Remember, phytoplanktons are photosynthetic organisms living in water. And then because zooplankton, they're kind of like little animals that eat phytoplankton, because zooplanktons eat phytoplankton, they can only live in the photic zone as well. Because those two kind of, have a relationship. So when we have phytoplankton, we will also have zooplankton, and they both can only be found in the photic zone. In the aphotic zone, there is no photosynthesis, but there's still some organisms that can live there. But in general, photic zone has a lot more activities and has more biodiversity, which means there are more different kinds of species living there. So if you look at this picture right here, it tells you the photic zone is kind of on the top, and then we have the aphotic zone that does not allow photosynthesis. Here are pictures of phytoplankton and zooplankton. Benthos, you don't have to memorize this, but just kind of understand that there are also organisms that can live in the aphotic zone. There aren't a whole lot of them compared to the photic zone, but we do have, for example, benthos, which are they can do chemosynthesis, where they can use the underwater volcano eruption and the nutrients in there to make nutrients for themselves. So benthos are organisms living on the bottom of water bodies. Sometimes they could be in the photic zone, sometimes they could be in the aphotic zone, depending on how deep the water is. The next one is temperature and currents, right? It just makes sense. Currents affect temperature, and temperature itself affect the habitat for aquatic ecosystem, for the aquatic organisms. The next one is nutrient availability. It's important to know what nutrient is. Nutrient is a matter that can supply the cell activities for a certain living organism. So it has to be something that you can get a hold of. This means sunlight is not a nutrient. Sunlight is an energy source that allows cell activities to happen, but sunlight itself has no weight, and you can't hold sunlight in your hand, right? It doesn't work, even though you can have light in a certain room, but you can't hold the sunlight. However, there are other matters, there are other elements that create bigger molecules that you can actually get a hold of. So for example, oxygen, it has a certain weight and it takes up a certain space. nitrogen as well, potassium and phosphorus. Those are all nutrients that organisms need in their system in order to do all the basic cell activities. So these nutrients and the availability of these nutrients affect organisms' life in water. The next one is the different types of freshwater ecosystems. So here we have lake, and here we have river and streams. Here we have a lake or a pond, and here we have a wetland. So if you look right here, it says the three categories are rivers and streams. Remember, this is the freshwater ecosystem. We're not talking about saltwater, just freshwater. So we have river and streams, we have lakes and ponds, and we have freshwater wetland. Freshwater wetland. So this is where we don't have as much water as the river and streams and the lakes and ponds, but we do have enough water to allow a lot of organisms to live. And the water only covers the soil a little bit, but it's very shallow. The next one is called estuaries. Estuaries, you need to remember, it's not a freshwater ecosystem. One more time. Estuaries are not freshwater ecosystems. Why is that? It's not saltwater ecosystem either. Why is that? Because it's a special type of wetland formed when a river meets the sea. It's a mixture of fresh water and the salt water. Okay, this is often shallow. So if you look right here, this little area right here would be estuaries. And this mixture of fresh water and salt water allows a lot of organisms to live. So the result is there's a very high amount of biomass, and there are a lot of species, but not as many species compared to freshwater and marine ecosystem. But still, it's really important to have estuaries because it does create a pretty big ecosystem or a pretty big habitat for a lot of living organisms. The next one we want to talk about is the marine ecosystem. What you have to know is the different zones of the marine ecosystem. So if you look vertically, we have the Photic Zone on the top, and we have the Aphotic Zone that sunlight cannot get through. And if you look horizontally, we have these other three zones. We have the intertidal zone. We have the coastal zone, or coastal ocean, and we have the open ocean. So the intertidal zone is right by the shore. And what's special about it is, if you think about tides, right? Tides have high tide and we have a low tide. During high tide, there are organisms that live in the intertidal zone, and they're submerged in water. So we have this little organism, and during high tide is in the water. But during low tide, it will get exposed to air and it's no longer in the water. So this is what's special about the intertidal zone. The organisms living in this zone have to be able to survive in salt water in the ocean, and it has to be able to survive in the air. So that's something. We can't necessarily do that for a very long time, right? But for example, barnacles, they can be just fine being exposed to air for a long time, and they'll be just fine in water. So that's the intertidal zone, as you can see in this picture. The next one is the coastal ocean. You can just remember this picture right here. That's the coast. That's where you go at the beach. And you should know that we have freshwater runoff that enters the coastal ocean, and that's not good. There's very high productivity because it's very close to land. That means it gets a lot of nutrients from the land. It's very shallow. But because of all that nutrients, we can have very high productivity, high biodiversity, high productivity, meaning that we have a lot of living organisms. And examples of organisms that live there is kelp forest and coral reefs. So all those organisms are able to live in the coastal ocean zone. The next one is the open ocean. The open ocean is way out. You won't be able to get to it just by walking or swimming. You can get to the coastal ocean, you get right to the intertidal zone, but the open ocean is way out there. So if you see right here, the open ocean is where we can talk about the Photic Zone and the Aphotic Zone. The coastal ocean is obviously all photic because the water is shallow, but for the open ocean, there's the Photic Zone that has, again, phytoplankton and zooplankton. It allows most of the photosynthesis on Earth because there's so much open ocean. And then the last one is that there's also underneath 200 meters, there's the Aphotic Zone. The Aphotic Zone is a messy place. It's a place that's very mysterious, and we still don't know a lot about it. And it's a dangerous environment for a lot of organisms because there's very high water pressure. It's very cold in there, and it's completely dark, which is not what most organisms that we know of are very used to. So it's quite interesting. Maybe you'll become a marine scientist and study the Aphotic Zone. And this is where chemosynthetic producers are able to live, because in order to provide food for itself, a lot of times they can't depend on other organisms. The organisms living in the Aphotic Zone cannot depend on a lot of other organisms, and then they can't get sunlight to make their own food, so they could use chemicals that's already in the water to make food for themselves, and we call that primary producers. So rewind. Here are all the things that you learned today from this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.